A solitary, mournful train whistle shrieks through the dense, gray fog, piercing the silence of a nation still bleeding from the open wounds of the Civil War. America's a fractured giant in 1865, a chaotic vacuum of power where the old political gods are dead and new titans are yet to be crowned. The assassination of Lincoln has left a hollow space in the soul of the country, creating a fertile, lawless soil for a different kind of emperor to rise. Emerging from this mist is Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, a man carved from granite and brine, standing as the undisputed master of the physical world. He is the old lion, battle-scarred and fiercely territorial, viewing the expanding continent not as a democracy, but as a chessboard for his own private conquest. Vanderbilt does not believe in the subtle arts of negotiation. He believes in the absolute crushing weight of leverage and the brutal efficiency of total ownership. He looks upon the fragmented rail lines of the Northeast and sees a chaotic nervous system that requires a single, ruthless brain to function. To the Commodore, competition is merely a defect in the market, an inefficiency that must be corrected by the consolidation of power into one iron fist. But even a king faces insurrection, and the rival rail owners believe they can starve the lion by cutting him off from the vital arteries of New York City. They underestimate the Commodore's willingness to burn the very infrastructure of commerce if it means choking his enemies into absolute submission. In a move of staggering audacity, Vanderbilt orders the blockade of the Albany Bridge, the sole gateway for freight moving in and out of the nation's beating heart. This is not merely a business tactic. It is an act of war, a physical firewall erected to demonstrate that he holds the keys to the kingdom. Imagine the millions of pounds of cargo rotting in the sun, the economy paralyzed, as Vanderbilt sits in his office, calmly smoking a cigar, watching the world panic. This is the ancient version of deplatforming. He who controls the bridge controls the flow of information, goods, and ultimately, the reality of the market itself. Consider the modern parallel. Vanderbilt is the original big tech monopolist, realizing that owning the platform is infinitely more powerful than selling the products upon it. The rival barons, desperate and bleeding cash, come crawling to the Commodore, begging for access, their stock prices plummeting into the abyss of irrelevance. Vanderbilt buys them out for pennies on the dollar, consolidating his empire into the New York Central, the greatest railroad entity the world has ever seen. He creates the Grand Central Depot, a physical cathedral to his own ambition, a monument declaring that all roads essentially lead to Cornelius Vanderbilt. But a railroad is a beast that must be fed, and iron rails are worthless without the constant, heavy flow of cargo to justify their existence. The Commodore has conquered the East, but he now faces a terrifying realization. He has built the world's largest pipeline, but he has nothing new to fill it. The trains are running empty, and the old lion, despite his immense wealth, feels the cold wind of obsolescence blowing from the untamed West. He needs a new commodity, something volatile and revolutionary that can match the scale of his rail network and keep his empire from starving. Deep in the industrial grime of Cleveland, Ohio, a new force is stirring, a substance that promises to light the night and change human existence forever. Kerosene is the new gold, a refined spirit of the earth that is replacing the dying whaling industry and bringing illumination to the working class. And watching over this volatile new industry is a young man named John D. Rockefeller, a figure who stands in stark contrast to the boisterous Vanderbilt. Rockefeller is the cold specter, disciplined, ascetic, and fueled by a terrifyingly quiet conviction that he is an instrument of God's will. While Vanderbilt is the noise and fury of the steam engine, Rockefeller is the silence of the ledger, the precision of the chemist, and the patience of the spider. He starts with nothing but a sharp mind and a devout belief that the oil industry is a chaotic mess of gamblers that requires divine order. To Rockefeller, the wild swings of the oil market are sinful. He seeks to impose stability through rigorous, unyielding efficiency and control. He understands that the driller takes the risk, but the refiner takes the profit, provided the refiner can control the cost of transportation. Vanderbilt, desperate to fill his trains, looks west and spots this rising refiner, seeing him not as a rival, but as a potential pawn in his game. The Commodore summons Rockefeller to New York, expecting a desperate provincial businessman who will be easily cowed by the grandeur of the empire. But as Rockefeller prepares for the meeting, fate intervenes in a way that will forever alter the psychological landscape of the young tycoon. He is running late for the train, a rare lapse in his meticulous discipline, and he watches in frustration as the locomotive pulls away from the station without him. Moments later, that very train derails, plunging into a ravine and a twisted wreckage of burning iron and screaming metal, killing nearly everyone on board. Rockefeller stands at the precipice, looking down at the carnage, and feels a chilling realization wash over him. He was spared for a purpose. This is the pivot. He is no longer just a businessman, but a vessel of destiny, convinced that God has preserved him to bring order to the chaos of the world. He arrives in New York not as a supplicant, but as a man who believes he carries the mandate of heaven in his pocket, unafraid of earthly kings. Vanderbilt attempts to intimidate the young man, treating him like a junior officer, but he is met with a gaze that is unsettlingly calm and devoid of fear. Rockefeller does not negotiate for a lower rate. He demands a rebate, a kickback on every barrel he ships, and a tax on every barrel his competitors ship. It is a proposal of stunning arrogance. He is asking Vanderbilt to subsidize his business while simultaneously penalizing his own potential future customers. But Rockefeller offers something Vanderbilt cannot refuse: a guaranteed volume of oil that will keep the Commodore's trains full every single day, rain or shine. Vanderbilt, recognizing a fellow predator, accepts the deal, believing he has secured a steady stream of cargo for his iron veins. He does not realize he has just signed the death warrant of the free market, handing Rockefeller the weapon he needs to slaughter his competition. With the preferential rates in hand, Standard Oil becomes an unstoppable machine, undercutting every other refinery in Cleveland until they face a binary choice: sell or die. Rockefeller is not emotional about these acquisitions. He shows them his books, proves they cannot compete, and offers them a fair price to join his great combination. Those who refuse are crushed with a mathematical ruthlessness, their businesses strangled by transport costs until they wither into bankruptcy and dust. Is this monopoly? Or is it the inevitable evolution of efficiency, the survival of the fittest, played out in the ledger books of industrial America? Rockefeller dominates the kerosene market, eventually controlling 90% of the oil in North America, a level of power that rivals the government itself. But as Standard Oil grows, it becomes larger than the railroads that feed it, shifting the balance of power from the transport tycoon to the commodity king. Vanderbilt, sensing the monster he has helped create, realizes he is no longer the master of the arrangement, but merely the servant of Rockefeller's cargo. The old lion is not accustomed to servitude, and his pride bristles at the thought of being dictated to by the pious, quiet man from Cleveland. Vanderbilt decides to form an alliance with his bitter rival, Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, to squeeze Rockefeller and force him to pay higher rates. It is a cartel of the carriers, a union of the iron giants, designed to remind the oil man who truly owns the infrastructure of the nation. They assume Rockefeller has no choice but to pay, for how else can he move his oil across the vast distances of the continent without their tracks? But they fail to understand that Rockefeller views obstacles not as walls, but as puzzles to be solved by superior innovation and lateral thinking. When the railroads unite to raise prices, Rockefeller does not panic. He retreats into the silence of his mind to find a solution that bypasses them entirely. He looks at the very physics of transportation and asks a dangerous question. Why must oil move in barrels on wheels when it flows like water? This is the moment of disruption, the conceptual leap that separates the visionary from the operator, the software engineer from the hardware manufacturer. Rockefeller decides to build a pipeline, a massive artery of steel that will pump oil directly from the wells to the refineries, bypassing the railroads completely. It is a project of immense technical difficulty, a moonshot for the 19th century that many dismiss as impossible and foolhardy. But Rockefeller pours his capital into the venture, driving his men to lay miles of pipe through forests and over mountains, relentless in his pursuit. The pipeline is the internet of its day, a decentralized network that renders the legacy infrastructure of the railroads suddenly, violently obsolete. When the taps are turned on, the oil flows silently underground, and the long trains of Vanderbilt and Scott sit idle in the yards, empty and rusting. It is a catastrophic blow to the railroad industry, a structural shift in the world's DNA that breaks the monopoly of the transport barons forever. Vanderbilt, the man who believed he owned the world, watches his stock price collapse as the realization hits. The cargo has found a new way to travel. In this game of giants, are you the driver of the machine or merely the fuel for someone else's engine? Vanderbilt realizes he has been the latter. The old lion fights back, but he is fighting gravity. The age of iron is yielding to the age of oil, and the future belongs to the energy, not the track. Rockefeller stands in his office, reading the reports of the pipeline's success, his face betraying no emotion, only the quiet satisfaction of a prophecy fulfilled. He has not just beaten Vanderbilt, he has rendered him irrelevant, rewriting the rules of capitalism to favor the owner of the resource over the owner of the path. The financial panic that follows the railroad crash sends the country into a depression, shattering the economy and ruining countless lives in the process. Rockefeller sees this chaos not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to buy up the remaining fractured pieces of the industry at bargain prices. He is the ultimate contrarian, buying when blood is in the streets, confident that his vision of order will eventually prevail over the temporary madness. Vanderbilt, now aging and approaching the end of his life, is forced to acknowledge the supremacy of the young titan he once thought he could control. The relationship between these two men is a mirror of the American soul. The tension between the brute force of the pioneer and the calculated efficiency of the corporatist. As Vanderbilt's health fails, the era of the rugged individualist, the pirate king who rules by personality, begins to fade into the twilight of history. Rising in its place is the era of the institution, the faceless, deathless corporation that exists beyond the lifespan of any single man. Rockefeller's Standard Oil is the prototype for the modern multinational, a web of influence that spans borders and governments, answerable only to the bottom line. Yet, in the quiet of his room, Rockefeller wrestles with the isolation of his position, the cold specter haunted by the sheer magnitude of his own creation. He believes he is doing God's work by bringing order, but the world sees him as a monster, a devouring leviathan that consumes everything in its path. The public outcry against monopolies begins to grow, a distant rumble of thunder that will eventually manifest as the Sherman Antitrust Act. But for now, Rockefeller is untouchable, the richest man the world has ever known, transcending the wealth of kings and emperors of the past. Vanderbilt lies on his deathbed, surrounded by a family squabbling over his fortune, a final testament to the chaos he lived by but could never truly conquer. His last words are not of business, but of legacy, wondering if the name Vanderbilt will endure in a world now fueled by Rockefeller's oil. The passing of Vanderbilt marks the end of the first chapter of American capitalism, the closing of the frontier, and the beginning of the industrial age. Rockefeller attends the funeral not as a mourner, but as a victor. the silent observer who has studied the old lion's mistakes and perfected his methods. He knows that his own war is far from over. The pipeline was just the beginning, and new enemies will rise to challenge his dominion over the night. But Rockefeller is patient. He thinks in decades, not quarters, building a fortress of trusts and holding companies that will baffle regulators for generations. The lesson of their rivalry echoes through time. It is not enough to be strong. One must be adaptable, willing to destroy one's own business model to survive. Would you have the courage to kill your darling business, as Rockefeller killed his reliance on railroads, to save the future of your empire? The train whistle that opened our story is now replaced by the hum of the refinery, the mechanical heartbeat of a new world order. The fog has lifted, but the landscape has changed. The tracks are still there, but they are no longer the veins of the nation the pipeline is. Rockefeller sits alone in the center of his web, the uncrowned king of America, proving that while Vanderbilt conquered the land, Rockefeller conquered the light. Success is not a destination, but the ability to see the roads that everyone else insists do not exist, even if you have to build them underground. The story of Vanderbilt and Rockefeller is the story of us, of our ambition, our greed, and our relentless drive to organize the chaos of existence. It is a reminder that in the forge of history, men are merely the raw material, hammered into shape by the necessities of the era they inhabit. The iron horse bows to the black gold, and the torch is passed from the visible hand of the Commodore to the invisible hand of the trust. And somewhere, in a garage or a dorm room today, a new Rockefeller is watching the giants of tech, waiting for the moment to build their own pipeline. For the war between the gatekeeper and the disruptor never truly ends. It just changes the battlefield and the weapons of choice. The cycle continues, the wheel turns, and the next empire is already waiting in the wings, ready to devour the old gods. The completion of the pipeline is not greeted with applause, but with the primitive violence of a cornered animal lashing out at its captor. The railroad barons, led by the Pennsylvania Railroad's Tom Scott, Vanderbilt's tenuous ally, realize that this 4-inch pipe is a noose around their necks. They resort to industrial sabotage, hiring thugs to dig up the lines and beat the construction crews in the dead of night. This is the physical manifestation of switching costs. The old guard will burn the world down before they allow a new technology to render them obsolete. Rockefeller responds not with violence, but with the terrifying calm of a grandmaster who has already calculated the checkmate 12 moves ahead. He hires his own private army, not to start a war, but to stand in silent, armed rows guarding the serpent of steel winding through the Pennsylvania woods. Do not fire unless fired upon, he commands, but do not yield a single inch of ground to the men of iron. The pipeline begins to pump, and the sound is a death rattle for the speculative bubble that has sustained the American economy since the war. Wall Street has bet everything on the railroads, leveraging the entire nation's wealth on the assumption that the trains will always be the kings of commerce. But when Rockefeller bypasses them, the revenue stops, the confidence evaporates, and the fragile house of cards begins to tremble in the wind. In 1873, the unimaginable happens. The stock market crashes, triggering the first Great Depression of the industrial age. Men who were millionaires at breakfast are paupers by dinner, leaping from windows as the ticker tape spells out their doom. The Panic of 1873 is a wildfire that clears the forest, destroying the weak, the overleveraged, and the foolish who believe the good times would never end. Vanderbilt, sequestered in his mansion, watches his net worth fluctuate violently, a grim reminder that even the old lion is not immune to the fire. But where others see the apocalypse, Rockefeller sees the Great Sale, a divine intervention designed to consolidate the industry into his capable hands. While the world screams, Rockefeller buys. He buys refineries. He buys bankrupt railroads. He buys the very infrastructure of his enemies for pennies. internal monologue. They call this a crisis. I call it a cleansing. The chaos is merely the dust settling into the order I was born to create. Is it greed to buy the wreckage, or is it stewardship to save the assets from the incompetent hands that crashed them in the first place? This is the brutal logic of the distressed asset acquisition, a tactic used by modern private equity firms to devour failing giants. Rockefeller stands amidst the financial ruin of Cleveland, a solitary figure in a black coat, purchasing the dreams of his rivals with a stroke of a pen. He does not gloat. He offers them a choice. Take Standard Oil stock and retire with dignity, or compete and be crushed by the weight of the inevitable. Most take the stock, unknowingly becoming incredibly wealthy as they surrender their autonomy to the man they once called a villain. Tom Scott, the man who tried to break Rockefeller, is now broken himself, his railroad empire crumbling under the weight of debt and empty trains. Vanderbilt, seeing his ally fall, realizes that the war of iron versus oil has been decisively won by the fluid that fuels the lamps. The Commodore, now in his final years, retreats from the public eye, his roar reduced to a grumble, his era formally concluding in the shadow of the trust. But victory brings a new kind of isolation for Rockefeller. He is no longer just a businessman, but the most hated man in America. The public looks at the closed factories and the unemployment lines and blames the monopoly, seeing Standard Oil as a multi-headed hydra strangling the free market. Rockefeller is baffled by the hatred. Does he not provide the cheapest, safest kerosene in history? Has he not saved the whales and lit the night? He believes he is a benevolent dictator, an industrial savior who has lowered the price of light for the common man by eliminating wasteful competition. Competition is sin, he tells his Sunday school class, because it represents a duplication of effort and a waste of God's resources. This is the central paradox of the Titan. The man who democratized light through cheap oil did so by destroying the democracy of the marketplace. Modern parallel. Consider the tech giant that offers free services to billions while crushing every startup that attempts to innovate in its shadow. Is the convenience of the platform worth the cost of the monopoly? This is the question that haunts the legacy of John D. Rockefeller. As the Depression drags on, labor unrest begins to boil over. The workers of the railroads, their wages slashed, begin to riot in the streets. Pittsburgh burns as the anger of the proletariat clashes with the indifference of the capital class. Rockefeller watches the flames from a distance, secure in his belief that his pipelines are immune to the strikes that paralyze the railroads. He has built a system that requires fewer men and more machines, an automation of logistics that insulates him from the chaos of human labor. The cold specter has effectively removed the human variable from the equation of business, turning commerce into a pure, frictionless machine. But deep down, does he feel the chill? Does the silence of his empire ever grow too loud in the empty halls of his home? He retreats further into his religion, donating tithes with the same mathematical precision he applies to his refining costs. God gave me my money, he famously says, a statement that is both an act of extreme humility and terrifying arrogance. If success is ordained by God, then resistance to Standard Oil is not just bad business, it is heresy against the natural order of things. Vanderbilt, on his deathbed, finally acknowledges the shift. I was strong, he might have thought, but he is inevitable. The death of Vanderbilt is the final curtain on the age of the brawler, the pirate who fought with his fists and his wits on the open water. Rockefeller does not attend the funeral to mourn a friend, but to witness the burying of an epoch, the interment of the chaos that preceded him. He stands at the graveside, a specter in a top hat, surrounded by the weeping heirs who will squander the Commodore's fortune in a generation. Rockefeller knows that wealth must be guarded like a fortress, not spent like water. He is building a dynasty that will outlast the stone of the grave. But a new enemy is rising, one that cannot be bought with stock or crushed with a rebate. the government of the United States. The sheer size of Standard Oil has alerted the politicians, the trust busters, who see Rockefeller not as a genius, but as a threat to democracy itself. The cartoons begin to appear. Rockefeller as an octopus, its tentacles wrapped around the Capitol, the White House, and the Supreme Court. The old lion Vanderbilt fought rival barons. The cold specter Rockefeller must now fight the collective will of the people. He hires a legion of lawyers, the finest legal minds money can buy, to construct a labyrinth of holding companies to hide his assets. This is the birth of the corporate veil, the legal fiction that allows a man to own everything while appearing to own nothing. He creates the trust, a mysterious entity that controls the stock of all the subsidiary companies, a central brain for his industrial body. It is a stroke of evil genius, a way to circumvent the laws of the state by existing in the ether of legal ambiguity. You cannot prosecute a ghost, his lawyers whisper, and Standard Oil is everywhere and nowhere all at once. But the pressure mounts. The journalists, the muckrakers, begin to dig into the secret rebates and the dark deals of the past. Ida Tarbell, the daughter of a man Rockefeller crushed, begins to write the history of the Standard Oil Company, a serialized expose. Words, Rockefeller discovers, can be as damaging as dynamite if they are printed in a magazine read by millions of angry voters. For the first time, the man who controls the oil realizes he cannot control the narrative. Vanderbilt would have challenged the journalist to a duel or bought the paper. Rockefeller ignores them, believing that silence is the ultimate defense. Let them talk, he says. We will continue to saw wood, but the public anger is a fire that cannot be ignored forever. The narrative shifts from a business rivalry to a moral crusade. The people versus the plutocrat. Rockefeller finds himself subpoenaed, dragged into the courtrooms he despises, forced to answer for the crime of being too successful. He sits on the witness stand, an old man now, pretending to have forgotten the details, his memory foggy on the matters of rebates and ruin. It is a masterclass in evasion, a performance of senility, designed to frustrate the prosecutors who seek to dismantle his life's work. But beneath the mask of the confused grandfather is the sharp, predatory mind that built the greatest fortune in human history. He knows that even if they break the company, they cannot destroy the value. The parts are worth more than the whole. You may dissolve the trust, he thinks, but you cannot dissolve the demand. The world needs what I sell. And indeed, as the cars begin to replace the carriages, a new use for his oil gasoline promises to make him even richer than before. The irony is supreme. Just as the government moves to crush him, the invention of the internal combustion engine gives Standard Oil a second life. Vanderbilt's trains are now the slow past. The automobile is the fast future. And Rockefeller owns the fuel for every single one of them. Henry Ford is the new pioneer, but he is merely building the lamps. Rockefeller still owns the oil. The pivot from kerosene to gasoline is the greatest luck or divine providence in business history. Rockefeller watches the first cars sputter down the street and smiles. The waste byproduct he used to dump in the river is now liquid gold. He has won the game twice, once with light and now with motion. The ghost of Vanderbilt must surely be laughing in the ether, acknowledging that the cold specter has pulled off the ultimate coup. But the loneliness deepens. He is the wealthiest man in the world, yet he eats crackers and milk to soothe his ulcerated stomach. The stress of empire has taken its toll on his body, stripping him of his hair and his digestion, leaving him a withered husk of power. He begins to give it away, the philanthropy that will define the second half of his life, not out of guilt, but out of a need to organize the chaos of charity. He applies the same business principles to giving as he did to taking: efficiency, scale, and results. He creates the Rockefeller Foundation, a machine for doing good that is as ruthless in its effectiveness as Standard Oil was in its monopoly. Is this redemption? Can a man buy his way into heaven after starving his competitors? Or is philanthropy just another form of power, a way to shape the world's health and education according to his own vision? The duality of Rockefeller remains unresolved. The robber baron and the great benefactor, the devil and the saint, wrapped in one frail body. As we approach the final judgment of the Supreme Court in 1911, the tension reaches its breaking point. The old lion Vanderbilt is a memory, a statue in front of Grand Central. But Rockefeller is a living issue, a problem the nation must solve. The breakup of Standard Oil is imminent. The gavel is raised, and the hammer is about to fall on the empire of the cold specter. But Rockefeller is not afraid of the gavel. He knows something the judges do not. Breaking the monopoly will not destroy his wealth. It will unlock it, liberating the value of the subsidiary companies on the open market. Buy Standard Oil, he tells his golf partner. Buy all you can. Even in defeat, he is planning his greatest financial victory. The government thinks they are punishing him, but they are about to make him the first billionaire in history. It is the ultimate jujitsu move of capitalism, using the force of the regulator to multiply the wealth of the regulated. The conflict between the state and the corporation, between the collective and the individual, comes to a head. And standing in the center of the storm is the man who never missed a train again, the man who built the pipeline to the future. The legacy of the Vanderbilt-Rockefeller War is not just steel and oil. It is the blueprint for the modern world. We live in the house they built, arguing over the rent, while they sleep in the foundation. As the final part approaches, we must ask, what is the cost of such greatness? And who pays it? The curtain falls on the era of consolidation, only to rise on the era of fragmentation and the birth of the modern struggle. The year is 1911, and the Supreme Court of the United States delivers the hammer blow. Standard Oil is declared an illegal monopoly and ordered to dissolve. It is the death sentence of the trust, a victory for the government, and the supposed end of the Rockefeller reign. But as the news reaches the golf course where Rockefeller is playing, he does not wail or gnash his teeth. He simply hands his caddy a dime. "They have done me a great favor," he murmurs, knowing that the separate pieces of his empire will trade at a higher premium than the conglomerate ever did. Standard Oil is sliced into 34 distinct companies: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, a hydra that has not been killed but merely multiplied. Wall Street realizes the hidden value, and the stock prices of the baby standards explode, doubling Rockefeller's personal net worth overnight. He becomes the world's first billionaire, richer in defeat than he ever was in victory, proving that true power can survive even the wrath of the state. Vanderbilt died worrying about his fortune. Rockefeller watches his fortune grow beyond comprehension, fueled by the insatiable thirst of the automobile age. This is the ultimate lesson in anti-fragility, a system so perfectly engineered that chaos and attack only make it stronger. The rivalry between Vanderbilt and Rockefeller is now complete, a closed loop that explains the transition from the physical to the abstract economy. Vanderbilt was the king of matter, the man who moved heavy things across the earth, the master of the gateway. Rockefeller was the king of energy, the man who moved the fuel that powered the world, the master of the platform. Look at the modern landscape. Vanderbilt is the telecom provider laying the cables. Rockefeller is the internet giant controlling the data that flows through them. Vanderbilt's blockade of the Albany Bridge is the ancestor of the App Store ban, the gatekeepers shutting the door to extract a toll. Rockefeller's pipeline is the ancestor of the cloud, the infrastructure that bypasses the gatekeeper entirely to deliver value directly to the user. The disruption is not a modern invention of Silicon Valley. It was born in the mud of Pennsylvania when oil first flowed underground. As we look back at the old lion, we see the tragedy of a man who built a monument but failed to build a dynasty. Within 50 years of his death, the The Vanderbilt family gathering at Grand Central Station contained not a single millionaire among them. They spent the capital. Rockefeller invested the interest, creating a perpetual motion machine of influence that shapes global policy to this day. But let us not romanticize the cold specter too much. His efficiency came at the cost of his humanity, a soul calcified by the ledger. In his final years, looking like a parchment ghost, Rockefeller is desperate to be loved, handing out shiny dimes to children in the street. It is a poignant image. The man who owned the earth trying to buy affection with small change, realizing that some things cannot be monopolized. The internal monologue of the Titan falls silent, replaced by the noise of the century he helped create, the roar of engines and the hum of industry. Would you have the courage to kill your darling business to save the future of your empire? Rockefeller did, and he won. The railroads, once the invincible masters of the universe, are now a utility, a background service for the oil-fueled economy. It is a stark reminder that in business, nothing is too big to fail, only too slow to adapt. Today, the battleground has shifted from steel rails and oil pipes to fiber optics and neural networks. But the archetypes remain the same. There are still Vanderbilts, the loud conquerors who demand obedience. And there are still Rockefellers, the quiet architects who build the invisible cages. The gateway and the disruption are eternal forces, a yin and yang that drives the engine of human progress forward. As the camera pulls back from the grave of the Commodore and the estate of the Oil King, we see the skyline of modern America. It is a world of light and speed, a testament to the brutal, beautiful ambition of two men who refused to accept the world as it was. They were monsters, perhaps, but they were our monsters, the architects of the American century, who forged a superpower from chaos. The fog of the opening scene has cleared completely, revealing a complex, interconnected globe that pulses with the energy they unleashed. But the question remains for the viewer, for the modern entrepreneur sitting in the dark. Who are you in this story? Are you the one waiting for the train, or are you the one building the pipeline while the others sleep? The path to the crown is lonely, and the weight of it is heavy, but for those who dare to wear it, the view is absolute. We leave the Titans where we found them, in history, yet alive in every transaction, every tank of gas, and every digital connection we make. The torch passes not to the strong, but to the visionary, not to the one who fights the current, but to the one who redirects the river. Vanderbilt proved that you can own the bridge. Rockefeller proved that you can become the water. And in the end, the water always wins. The sun sets on the Gilded Age, but the lights of the city flicker on, powered by the legacy of the Standard Oil Trust. A young entrepreneur watches the lights from a high-rise window, plotting the next disruption, unaware that he is channeling the ghost of Rockefeller. The cycle begins anew. The code is the new oil, the server farm is the new refinery, and the data is the new gold. But the rules of the game have not changed. Identify the chaos, impose order, and ruthlessly eliminate the friction. The old lion roars in the history books, but the cold specter whispers in the boardroom, guiding the hand of the next generation. We are left with the final realization that these men were not anomalies. They were the inevitable result of a system that rewards the extreme. To build a new world, one must be willing to ruthlessly dismantle the old one, without apology or hesitation. The train whistle fades into memory, replaced by the silent, omnipresent hum of the digital network, the ultimate pipeline. And as the screen fades to black, the final truth of their lives echoes in the silence. Success is not a destination, but the ability to see the roads that everyone else insists do not exist.